Hello and welcome to the So What podcast, in which political economic analyst JP Landman discusses the issues uppermost in the minds of South Africans. You can find a written version of this content on JP's website, jplandman.co.za. I am Ruda Landman and I am your host. These first few recordings were done at our dining room table, but we will soon be moving into a studio. Hello and welcome once again to a recording to accompany JP's newsletter, this one dated the 26th of April 2022, under the title Connecting the Dots. It is going to be slightly longer than usual because the newsletter is slightly longer than usual. Maybe you want to listen to it in a few sessions. Maybe you want to pour yourself a glass of wine and settle in. Why use the metaphor of dots and connecting the dots?
It was Steve Jobs who said you can only connect the dots backwards. You cannot connect it forward. And I think that's absolutely applicable to where we are in South Africa in terms of political analysis. There are a lot of forecasts going around, a lot of predictions going around, a lot of comment going around. What I do in this newsletter is simply to focus on things that actually have happened. The dots are already on the page. We don't want to speculate about what the page will look like. The dots are on the page. So it's a backward-looking methodology, if you want. And we connect the dots, and then we see what the dots tell us. That's basically what I do in this newsletter.
The first group of dots, if I can put it that way, concern macroeconomic policy, macroeconomic framework. What exactly does that mean?
Macroeconomic policy refers to two things. First of all, monetary policy, or interest rates, independent reserve bank, inflation, fighting inflation, and so on. That's all monetary policy. And fiscal policy is the second leg, second part of macro policy, and that refers to government finances. Now, in the most up-to-date growth theory that we have in the world, that is one of the 5 critical elements of an economy that would like to grow. And that is you've got to have stable macroeconomic policy. In other words, stable monetary policy and stable fiscal policy. Now, I think what has been done in South Africa in the last couple of years, if we connect the dots, are quite remarkable. If I can go to monetary policy first, let's go back to the ANC's conference in December 2017 at Nasrec. There was a resolution adopted that the South African Reserve Bank must be nationalized and it must become part of the public sector, or it must be in government ownership. Also at that conference, there were all kinds of noises made about changing the inflation targeting regime in South Africa. 18 months after the conference, in June 2019, Ys Magashule, who was then still Secretary General of the ANC, pushed the envelope a bit further. He issued a press statement to say that the government should pursue quantity easing. He didn't get to quantitative, but he got to quantity easing, and he said that should be government policy. Also in that time, ex-President Zuma issued a tweet in which he said that quantity easing is indeed government policy, and if a government doesn't implement that, the government can be recalled. He clearly made a threat there. You will recall that at the same time, the public protector, in her infinite wisdom, issued a report in which he said the inflation targeting regime in the country must be recalled and the mandate of the Reserve Bank must be changed. There was a huge amount of political pressure on the bank. If you connect those dots in 2017, 18, 19, you can see to what extent there was a total onslaught on the South African Reserve Bank and by implication on independent monetary policy. In June 2019, on precisely Tuesday, the 4th of June 2019, Ys Magashule issued that statement of his, which prompted Mr. Zuma's tweet and so on. 48 hours later, on Thursday, the 6th of June, the top 6 of the ANC issued a statement from Luthuli House to say, this is not the policy of the ANC. The position of the bank remains unchanged. The authority of the Minister of Finance to decide on the inflation target was reconfirmed, and that was put out as official government policy. Ys Magashule then found himself in a terrible position that 48 hours after he issued a statement, he now had to issue another statement on behalf of the organization, and he, as one of the top 6, had to sign it, committing the ANC to the opposite of what he propagated. It was a clear victory for Mr. Ramaphosa, for sound monetary policy. And I think we can put June 2019 down as the month on which the tide was turned on the Reserve Bank. Not the only important developments, there were also court cases, but that's a different set of dots, and that has to do with a legal fight. I'm focusing here on the political dots. Also in that statement of the 6th of June 2019, the top 6 said, look, it is the policy of the ANC that the bank should be in public ownership, but we realize that there's a cost involved in it. In other words, you would have to pay shareholders out. In our current fiscal situation, we do not have the money for that, and it's not prudent to pursue that option. So that put the whole Reserve Bank thing to bed, so to speak. Now, note the dates here. We're talking June 2019. It was long before a thing called COVID. It was long before that disaster hit us. It was quite clear which way the political wind was blowing. So if you look back, since that time, since June 2019, it's now almost 3 years later, the stature of the bank, the status of the bank has grown further. Its independence is more assured. We've really deflected or defeated that attack that we saw on the South African Reserve Bank. So that's what the dots on monetary policy tell me. If you look at fiscal policy, it's much the same story. And there, the turning point for me was in February 2019, more than 3 years ago, when the president in the State of the Nation speech that February said very, very clearly, quote, "We will not spend our way out of our economic troubles," unquote. Again, that was before COVID. So that was not on the table at all, where he said, we cannot carry on in the way that we've been going. We've got to curb our spending. And that has been stuck to. Now, in 2020, of course, we got COVID and government expenditure increased considerably. But here is the benchmark. The economy shrank by about 6.5%. We now know, looking back. At the time, government stimulation measures to try and keep the economy going came to about 5.5%. And that is within the rule of thumb. The rule of thumb is if the economy contracts by 5 or 10%, then you must stimulate by 5 or 10%. And that's precisely what we've done. In fact, the one criticism many people make against the government on this particular dot is that we should have spent a bit more. 5.5% was not enough. We should have spent 6 or 7%. Whatever, that is what the dot tells us. In 2019 also, when the president made that speech, it was 3 months before the election. And the chattering classes were going ballistic about how we're going to see a splurge of spending. Looking back, what does the dot tell us? The dot tells us that in that election here, spending was only 0.3% more than the ceiling which was set by Treasury. I really don't think that's a catastrophe. In fact, I think it's quite an achievement. So if you look back at COVID, you look back at the Natal unrest that we had in 2021, you look back at the load shedding that we had on top of COVID, then I think the fact that government succeeded in staying the course with expenditure is no mean achievement. Now, how did that come about? People immediately want to say, oh, it's because there was a commodity boom and we got extra money from there and that helped us. That's quite right. There was a commodity boom, but before the commodity boom, in other words, in the first half of 2021, 2 other things happened. First, government took a very firm stance on civil service increases and broke their negotiated agreement with the unions on 3 years of guaranteed increases. Now, the political significance of this mustn't escape one. Ramaphosa was brought into power with the support of COSATU, also others, but definitely COSATU. Now he goes and he breaks an agreement which was negotiated with them. His government breaks it, and he says, we can't give that to you. That is not a sign of political weakness. That is not a sign of not looking after your fiscal expenditure. So that year, the increases were null. In the following year, the increases were kept to a minimum, and we will see what happens in 2022. But certainly the tough decisions to tackle civil service increases have been made, and the consequences are working through. How do we know that? Because in April, Moody's changed their outlook for South Africa from negative to stable. So clearly, they can see that the dots are lining up behind prudent fiscal policy. Then we had the lucky break of extra money from the commodity boom. And again, government didn't squander it. It was used to reduce the deficit. And of course, part of it was used to subsidize people after the Natal unrest. So I'm very happy, if we look back, that fiscal and monetary policy, that we're meeting the requirements of what has to be done in that area. And that's what I think what the dots tell us.
Something that your newsletter also points out, and that I think we must actually remember, is how close we came to a very rough edge with the attacks on Treasury.
Very important point, and one which was confirmed this last week by the release of the fourth part of the Zondo Commission's report, where Mr. Zondo detailed the attacks on Treasury. You know, if you remember that weekend special, Des van Rooyen as Minister of Finance, if you remember that about 15 months later, a year later, both the Minister of Finance, Gordhan, and the Deputy Minister Jonas, were both just summarily dismissed. Zuma was really going for the Treasury. In the end, he failed. He may have come within a whisker, but the fact is he failed. And that's the important point to bring across. And I think where we are now, as the stature of the Reserve Bank has risen and become really unassailable, I think inside government, the stature of Treasury has likewise risen, and we can talk about that under structural reform to indicate to what extent that has happened. So I'm really very happy with what I said, that I think if you look back and you connect the dots on fiscal and monetary policy, we've done well.
Your next heading is structural reform, and that's the next group of dots, if we can put it that way.
Yes.
But structural reform seems to me can mean almost anything to anyone. What do you mean? What do you think the government means when they talk about structural reform?
Yeah, it's a very good point. Structural reform means different things to different people. On the left of our politics, it means take away the independence of the Reserve Bank, push up the budget deficit, print money to cover it, and so on. On the right-hand side of our political spectrum, it deals with deregulate labor markets, ban unions, there mustn't be minimum wages, and all that kind of nonsense. What does government mean? Government has put down a very simple 8 points or 8 bullets, an 8-point framework. The first one, which is monetary and fiscal policy, which we've already discussed. And the remaining 6, there are 8 in total, fiscal monetary policy. The remaining 6 basically deal with introducing the private sector into what is called the network industries. And the network industries is telecommunications, internet, that whole area, spectrum. It's transport, railways and harbors, and it is infrastructure. There is an 8th element which we can talk about, and that is what you can call social employment. So those are the 8 things that government understands under their policy. That's how I read their policy. And we can take them one by one. The most important one, because it's happened already, is spectrum release. As you know, spectrum release was delayed for 10 years. For the first 8 of the 10 years, because of political ineptitude and fighting between the minister and the regulator and so on, U-turns that was made by the Zuma government, that was eventually sorted out after Ramaphosa came into power. The last 2 years, it was delayed by private sector opposition to the proposals for spectrum release. That has now also been overcome. The auction has taken place and 14.4 billion rand came into the Treasury in payment for that. So that's, I think, a huge dot. Just by the way, Ruda, we must just note that when it comes to telecommunications and internet connection and so on, it's not just the government. It's also players outside government who've put down important dots. Think of the Facebook consortium that's building a cable linking the whole African continent with the world. And there's the Google cable, which is also supposed to be finished the end of this year, which will increase by 10 times all the current capacity linking South Africa to the international internet world. Nothing to do with government, but also happening. So I think that, and spectrum release and so on, you look at quite big changes. Inside South Africa, MTN, Vodacom, and Remgro subsidiary are working very hard to extend cheaper fiber connection into townships and rural areas at lower prices. All that will help to put South Africa on the front foot in terms of telecommunication. The second area is transport, and there basically railways and harbors. Now, again, just look back and get the long-term perspective. Portia Darby, the MD of Transnet, tells us, it's her words, not mine, that 2 years ago, the model was a state-run monopoly, a state-owned monopoly in railways and harbours. Now the policy is to allow the private sector in. It's a big change. The fact that it was brought about by circumstances, brought about by pressure, well, that is how life works. And there's two ways that you can deal with pressure. You can ignore it and try to stumble through, or you can change direction. Clearly, there's a big change in direction. Again, one must have a feeling here for the practical difficulties. Before you can allow the private sector into ports or railways, two things had to happen. You had to separate the operations of Transnet and Portnet from the regulatory function. They were basically judge and prosecutor, if I can use that analogy, and you had to split those roles. Secondly, you had to split infrastructure from operations so that you can get a true measurement of what cost is. Then you know what to charge people who come and use the infrastructure. Those two things took about 18 months, 2 years. They've now basically been completed, and what has happened in the last couple of months is a request for proposals was put out for a big new pier in the Durban harbour. A request was put out for Kuga, and over the Easter weekend, just before the Easter weekend, a request was put out for a liquid gas terminal in Richards Bay. So you can clearly see which way Transnet is moving, or Portnet is moving. As far as railway lines go, at the beginning of April, Transnet Freight Rail opened up slots in the Gauteng-Durban corridor for private operators to use. Now, here I just want to make a point. There's a huge amount of public discourse going on about the fact that Transnet and private operators are very far apart on the conditions and so on. Let's just stand back a little bit here. South Africa has got a long history. It's a 100-year-old history, more than 100 years, of state monopolies in the network industries. It goes back to the days of South African railways and harbours. It goes back to the days of the South African Post Office, long before Telkom. So we have a centuries-old approach to these matters. Now you change it over from a state monopoly to private sector players participating. You've got to make new rules. You've got to develop new practices. What are those rules? Who must carry the risk? Who must pay for maintenance? Who carries the depreciation charge? What return will be a feasible return? Over what period? 2 years, 20 years, 200 years? You've got to work these things out. They don't descend to you from heaven. We've worked them out in the case of toll roads. And how did SANRAL work it out? Well, Nazir Ali at the time brought everybody into the same room. The lawyers, the engineers, the builders, the government, the regulators, the bankers, who must finance everything. And between them, they sorted out the toll road model, which is working fairly well for South Africa. Now you'll have to go through a similar process now with railway lines. You'll have to go through a similar process with ports. And that's part of developing, moving over from a state-run monopoly to one in which the private sector participates. And I think this hysteria that we get from the chattering classes every time there's a kind of a disagreement is also really an area that asks for us to grow up.
I think you need a little bit of empathy with people's frustration, because things are announced and then it takes 2 years before anything happens. So it is human to get frustrated.
It may be human, but you should also know why it is taking 2 years. If you have to separate the regulator from the operator, and you have to separate infrastructure out, that kind of thing, we also need empathy for that. The reality is that it takes time to develop new practices, and that's where we are.
We don't live in a Mary Poppins world.
No, we don't.
The next thing on your list of patterns of dots is energy reform. You have spoken about this quite often, and there is a lot of information, there are a lot of numbers in this section. So I'm going to ask you to try and just very broad strokes, and then we refer the listeners to a graph which is on the website.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, in the last 2 years, I've written about energy 7 times, explaining what I think is going to happen and what indeed is now happening. Everything that we said will occur is proceeding. So it's quite gratifying from that point of view. I don't want to repeat any of that today. So All I do in my note is to focus on the recent load shedding. And here is the focus. We have load shedding in South Africa because we produce between 4,000 and 6,000 megawatts too little power. That's why we have load shedding. If we can wave a Harry Potter wand and tomorrow morning have 6,000 megawatts of extra power, there will be no load shedding. So it is now very simple. Just look at what is being done. Just connect the dots on what is being done to produce that 6,000 megawatts. And as you say, there's a lovely graph which you have developed, which is in the text. And it basically tells us that that 6,000 deficit that we've got is at the moment being covered by 11,500 megawatts of new capacity that's being installed. There is the last bid window 4, which is being connected to the grid this year, 500 megawatts. There is the emergency power procurement, which is dominated by Car Powership. Forget about Car Powership. It doesn't look as if that deal will happen. But that was only 1,200 of 2,000 megawatts. There's 800 megawatts left over. So you can add that in. Then there is the announcement of October 2020 that municipalities can generate their own power. So far, only 2 municipalities have made use of it. Johannesburg was the first. Cape Town has done it recently. That adds up to about 300 or 500 megawatts. More municipalities will follow, I'm quite sure. But again, it takes time to work through these processes. You know, you don't wave your hand and then you have a municipality procuring power. The big game changer was in June 2021, when the president announced that you no longer need a license if you generate power up to 100 megawatts. The ceiling used to be 1 megawatt. Now, from 1 to 100 is an enormous jump. And not only that, the president also announced in that announcement that you can generate the power below 100 for yourself or anybody else. And you can sell it to anybody. This is a huge change that took place. Something that we did predict in the 7 times that I wrote about energy, but it has now happened. Now, you can look at the graph in the piece. I'm not going to repeat it all, but all these changes that has already been announced, the decisions that have been taken, we're busy with implementation, will add up to about 11,500 megawatts versus a 4,000 to 6,000 deficit. Now, just be careful, 1 megawatt of renewable power is not the same as 1 megawatt of base power. But again, be careful, 2 things are shifting that. And that is, if your deficit is 6 and you get 11.5, you're covered to a large extent. And technology is also changing it. New storage technologies are coming in, which is making it possible for renewable operators to provide power 24 hours a day, even if they make use of renewable power. Near Postmasburg in the Northern Cape, there's a plant that is now run for, I think, 12 months, a solar plant, run for 12 months, providing power 24 hours a day because of storage technologies that they've got.
But I think you must make the point that this will be connected by 2025.
Yeah.
It has been procured, but it is still being installed, as you say.
Absolutely. Because it takes time to build a plant. Then you've got to connect it to the grid. Then you've got problems in the grid. You've got to sort that out. In general, you can talk about 24 months, but in some cases even a bit longer from the date that you start until you're actually connected to the grid. So this 11,500 on my cigarette box analysis will be connected to the grid by 2025. Now, that's still 3 years out. So that to me implies, unless something else changes, that we will have load shedding for another 3 years. But it also makes it very clear that load shedding will not be a permanent feature of our landscape. I think one should say that as well. I don't think we're looking at a situation like Nigeria, for example, where they've now had load shedding for many years and people have just given up on the national system. Here the national system is changing quite dramatically. And it's changing from one which is dominated by a state utility, a state monopoly, to one in which the private sector will operate. And by the way, talking about that, all the money needed for this 11,500 megawatts will come from private sector players. So you're talking massive investments that will take place in the economy. Already has taken place and will carry on taking place, pushing our investment numbers probably higher than what they were before COVID struck us.
The next group of dots concern infrastructure. You've always been quite cautious about infrastructure because you said so many people had to agree on so many things.
Yeah.
Is that shifting?
Yeah, I think it is shifting. It's precisely right. Doing infrastructure where you mix public and private money and you've got, private operators coming in, the kind of thing that we saw with toll roads, is quite a difficult thing to do. You need contracts, you need banking agreements, you need financial arrangements. Now, in the case of roads, we've worked it out. In other areas, we haven't worked it out. And some areas don't lend themselves to it. I don't think you can use, for example, private finance to do a school in a poor area. It just doesn't lend itself to it. But a couple of things have happened. The first is, when the president became president, he pushed the idea of the infrastructure fund. It took 3 years to get that going. He started with it in 2018. By 2021, the thing was established and operational. In this year's budget, the Treasury has allocated quite a few billion rand to it. I think the total for the period, for the 3 years that the budget rolls, is 13 billion or more. And they've committed themselves to Treasury has committed itself to 100 billion over 10 years. And the idea is that you mix in the infrastructure fund money from Treasury, from the taxpayer, and from the private sector. Now, what has changed now is that the first 7 projects have been approved by the infrastructure fund. The total investment will be about 21 billion, of which only 2.6 billion, a little bit more than 10%, is coming from the infrastructure fund or from the taxpayer. The rest is coming from private players and development institutions. Now, that tells you something about the ability of the infrastructure fund to leverage. If you can do 21 billion with 2.6 billion, then you're clearly in a new game. Now, it's the same story. You allow the private sector to come in to help to finance infrastructure. So I think that was quite an important shift that took place. The second shift that took place is that the budget for the year that just ended is 22% higher in terms of government infrastructure spending than what it was in the previous year. And in fact, we are now at the level where the rands being allocated are more than what it was before COVID. So there's clearly a comeback in terms of infrastructure spending. But I think the most important dot in this area of infrastructure, Ruda, is the dot where government last year said very clearly and unambiguously the state cannot do infrastructure. They have to involve the private sector. They have to develop skills and capacity. Now, that recognition is a little bit like, when you're an alcoholic, the road to recovery begins with admitting that you're an alcoholic. And what is happening at the moment is both at the Infrastructure Fund and at a unit called Infrastructure SA, which is in Patricia de Lille's department, Treasury, through its technical advice team, is busy developing the capacity and the skills of people to build project pipelines. And that's why I think the dial is beginning to move here. We are not nearly as far advanced as we are in energy, but I think the movement is clear.
So let's do a so what in the middle. What does all this mean? Why is it so important? Why do you write about it in such detail?
Well, common sense tells you that if you allow the private sector into previous state monopoly areas, you would expect, in theory, an increase in investment, and you would expect, in theory, an increase in productivity. And that is exactly what Treasury modeling has indicated. Treasury modeling indicates that these changes that we've been talking about can add as much as 1.7% to annual GDP growth. Now, our growth rate up till now has been around about 1.5%. So if you can add 1.7, you basically double growth rate. You take your growth rate from 1.5 to 3.2. 3.2% growth is double the population growth rate of 1.6%. So you're now getting back on track. You're now getting back to where we were in the first 10, 15 years after democracy, where the economy grew much faster than the population. And that generates extra resources that can be used to develop. Basically, I think we are busy going back to where we sort of ended, if I may use that word, in 2008. South Africa had a lovely run, also economically and politically, until about 2008, 2010. Then the Zuma era kicked in with full force, and we all know what happened there. Now I think we, with a growth rate of 3%, 3.25%, double your population growth rate, we're going back to where we were before the Zuma era struck us.
One thing that comes to mind for me, it sounds as if the famous or infamous trust deficit between the government and business or the private sector is being closed.
I wouldn't say that at this stage. Let's give it a little bit more time. The private sector, in my view, doesn't appreciate the fact that they've got, really for the first time since Mandela, they've got a business-friendly president. I don't think that penny has dropped yet. If you look at some of the things that are being said by business leaders and so on, they're not there yet. The government, on the other hand, doesn't have a full understanding yet of what it means to have the private sector participating. You know, what conditions, what payback periods, what return on capital, what carrying of risk is digestible and what not. So you've got problems on both sides. Business people don't appreciate what they've got in a business-friendly president, and the administration doesn't yet quite appreciate what it takes to run a business. So I think we'll have to slog a bit more to overcome that trust deficit.
The last thing that worries the whole of South Africa, of course, is the unemployment. Is the government doing anything which will shift that?
Well, as I said earlier, one of the 8 pillars, 7 of them deal with the economy. The 8th pillar deals with what I call social employment. And this is essentially employing people in all kinds of what you can call artificial ways. Not because that's a permanent solution, it's not, but because it brings temporary relief. And here the most important one is public employment. In October 2020, when COVID was really, at its most merciless, the government announced that 800,000 people will be employed in a public employment program. Now, these are not civil servants. Let's just be clear about that. When you say public employment, people immediately jump to civil service positions. That's not what it is. It's positions which gets a stipend of about 3,000 to 3,500 rand a month. So it's not a civil service job. And it's usually temporary. Now, at the moment, there are 850,000 people in this program, more than the 800,000 target. And there's money in the budget for the next 3 years to take that up to 1 million people. Now, if you have 1 million people in public employment, then have you shifted the numbers on the 12 million unemployed in the country? No, not really. But you are putting a lot of money through 3,500 rand a month. You're putting a lot of money into the poorest people of South Africa in an effort to help. Then there are a couple of other initiatives that was also launched under this program. The one is the SA Youth Mobi platform, which has got 2.3 million young South Africans registered on that platform, and 600,000 of them, 25%, have been placed in jobs. Then the National Youth Service, which has been around for a long time but has completely collapsed, has been revitalized, and they will probably employ 50,000 people this year. That is what has been budgeted for and what is planned. Now, again, will 50,000 people change the 12 million unemployed? No, it won't. But it will help 50,000 households. It will help 50,000 people to start getting into the labor market. And so there are 4 or 5 of these initiatives, what I call artificial initiatives, but they help to get people into the labor market. That's the important point. In the end, there's no substitute. If you want to employ more people, if you want to bring that 12 million unemployed, you need more economy. You're not going to employ 10 million more people in the same size economy. You need a bigger economy to employ more people. And that is where the structural reform measures come in. Until such time as the structural reform measures have kicked in and start having an effect, you need these kinds of short-term relief measures to combat poverty and keep stability in the country.
So if you step back and you look at the big picture, what are the main things that these dots tell you?
I think the main thing that it tells me is a point that I've already made, and that is that I think we're going back to where we were in 2008, 2009, at the end of the Mbeki period, when we had a successful run in our economy, where the economy grew faster than the population, where we increased incomes, and because we increased incomes, more money was available to be spent. I think we're going back there. We're leaving behind us the stagnation that we've had. of the last couple of years. That's the first point. The second point is, it was Bill Emmett, who was the editor of The Economist. He's now retired in Italy, I believe, who said that the journalist, like the instant analyst, is constantly at the risk of over-interpreting the short term and underrating the longer term. And I think there's a lot of that in South Africa. We are so carried away by the news headlines of the morning, never mind what will come this evening, that we run the risk of instant analysis and coming to the wrong conclusions. And that's where I think a longer-term view, which you can get by connecting the dots, is such an important input. And I think the other thing that I want to say is it was at the second investment conference in 2019, I think, where I was in the audience and I listened to the president, and he made a comment which for me summarized what he was busy with. It was the beginning of his tenure, it was before COVID, but you can see that that's how he governs. He said, there's an old saying that a man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away the small stones. A man who moves the mountain begins by carrying away the small stones. And I think that's what the Ramaphosa administration has been doing. They've been carrying away the small stones, which became bigger and bigger and bigger. And you see it beautifully illustrated in energy. You're beginning to see it in transport, in ports and railways. You've seen it in spectrum. I have no question that the stones will get bigger through a process of structural reform, and eventually we will move the mountain.
Thank you for listening to the So What podcast. If you enjoy this content, please don't forget to leave a review and a rating, and please consider subscribing so you don't miss any future episodes. Also, tell your friends. Remember, you can find a written version of all JP's content at jplandman.co.za.